Well, we have just finished 2 weeks shooting material in a Turin studio for the project of peopling the palaces. This project, I think, has been planned for at least 2 years now, so it's getting closer and closer and closer. And the contribution we've been making here is relative, I think, to something we couldn't, first of all, have done even 8 years ago, because the technology didn't exist. And it's basically, I suppose, touching for me on a whole series of areas which I've always been very interested in. One, I suppose, is just the nature of exhibition, museumology and curatorship. How do you present material that is true to our received notions of history, and how also to make it entertaining, to make it lively, and to make it grab people's attention. Descartes, famous French philosopher, suggested that first of all, before you can do anything with people, you've got to attract their curiosity. So we've got to find a project that stimulates their curiosity so that they can then go on to gain more and more information and hopefully to take an interest in history. Because history is very, very important. We cannot possibly exist without memory. Memory makes us. Memory gives us context. Memory gives us both a notion, of course, of the past, but also of the present and certainly of the future. History is no more than collective memory. So we have to put all our memories together in order to create a phenomenon of continuity. Having said that, in a way, there's no such thing as history. You can't visit history, you can't recreate history. So in a sense, I suppose I've been working for some years now on the premise that there's no such thing as history, but there's only historians. And if you take it even further, most people learn their history not from history books, but from the cinema. In the 19th century, most people learnt their history from literature, a whole series of very famous historical writers from, I don't know, Tolstoy to Dostoevsky to Zola to Dickens. They were all writing history. So most people learned history in the 19th century very largely from literature. I suppose in the 20th century, they essentially learned history from the cinema, which means a lot of things, of course. You know, is the Cleopatra that's created by Elizabeth Taylor, is that legend, is that mythology? I suppose one of the greatest history writers of the 19th century would be somebody like, I suppose, Walter Scott. But there's now another Scott. His name is Ridley Scott, and he's just made a film called Gladiator. And I think more people have an understanding of ancient Rome and the notions of the Colosseum through Ridley Scott than they ever will through 100,000 historians. So we, I suppose, in this studio, trying to remake history again, are part of that phenomenon. I find it fascinating, the ability that cinema has to be able to, in a curious way, recreate history and make it palatable. So I suppose my responsibility, being a guest of Venaria Reali, to attract people's attention, to excite them, to stimulate their curiosity, is a very interesting one. We have done it, as I said just now, with a whole series of phenomenon which is related to state-of-the-art video. We shot everything on high-definition television tape. In a sense, Venaria Reali have given us the architecture, they've given us the furniture, they've given us the paintings, but you can't put the people in. I suppose ideally, we must have filmed in the last 14 days at least 200 Italian actors and actresses. It'd be really nice to put all those people in the museum for the next 3 years, but of course it's absolutely impossible situation to do that. So we do the next best thing, we put their representation in. The way that Venaria Reali has been reconstructed is to leave very large white walls everywhere, dry, absorbent, porous plaster. And that's an absolute ideal medium for us to project on. I don't want to cover the whole of Venaria Reali in screens, because if you have a screen and there's nothing on it, it's like a blind eye with cataracts. It's most unattractive. But now we've got the possibility of really using the walls of the architecture of the place as our total cinema. So imagine going into Venaria Reali and, as it were, watching 300 cinema films all at once, which all interconnect, and of course sound as well. I've enjoyed myself about a year ago by writing nearly 200 scenes, some of them quite long, some of them quite short. I always thoroughly enjoy writing dialogue, so it wasn't a great effort for me, it was a delight. And we have found encapsulations of attitudes towards the museum based upon Italian actors and actresses speaking this dialogue in costume. We've had an extraordinary good team of Italian and Dutch and English people here who've all been coming together and working together very, very happily and satisfactory to be able to create this huge amount of material. About 6 months ago, I finished a feature film about Rembrandt, which is about to be shown at the Venice Film Festival. And I suppose in 2 weeks, we've shot more material than I shot for the entire 2-hour feature film. So we've been extraordinarily prolific and able to cover a huge amount of ground. So that's very exciting and very interesting. Okay, we've now got the film, or rather the tape, in the can. Now, with all my assistants and associates, we all go back to Amsterdam and we edit all this material. But what is interesting, we don't edit it in a normal narrative way. So A doesn't have to follow B, doesn't have to follow C. We don't have to worry about things like continuity or narrative consistency. And that's a remarkable and exciting ability to be able to use cinema. That's my long-standing feeling that cinema now is no more than bedtime stories for adults, and on the whole it's extremely boring. I think cinema is an extraordinary medium, but somehow curiously it's wasted on cinema. So if you can imagine that I suppose paradox, cinema is wasted on cinema. And the potentiality now of manipulating images, of reproducing them in 1,000 different ways, goes far and away above the limited use in which the notion of cinema on the high street puts it. So again, this is an exciting project for me, not only because of the content and the personification of history, but the actual way we're using the material. So I could count on the fingers of one hand different sorts of touch marks for me with this project, and I haven't even really begun to talk about the content. The French have been saying now for at least 60 years there's no such thing as content anymore, there's only language, so the language becomes the content. And I would like in this project to be able to imagine that that would be a really useful manifestation of this whole push towards where cinema is going. Because I certainly think that normal, orthodox, conventional cinema is dead. I think it's finished, it's outlived its purposes, and just the vested interests, which are far more related to money than they are interested in actual film, will continue maybe to pursue notions of conventional orthodox cinema maybe for another decade, but certainly as a radical form of expressing ideas, it's now outmoded, and in a sense it actually does belong in a film museum. So, what is it? What have we reached? 112 years of cinema, if you believe it began in 1895? It doesn't belong in cinemas anymore. It belongs in that stupid film museum that you have in the Moli Antonelliana. Enough? I do indeed think that cinema is mortal. There's a lot of evidence already that it is dying on its feet.